2012 has come to an end, and what a year for animation. As I've said before, I could not have picked a better year to start doing this, and given what I've seen from 2013, I've probably been kind of spoiled. But let's focus on the now. Now, since I don't have a whole lot of movies to choose from, given that I'm only focusing on the animated releases, I'm only going to give you my top 3 and my bottom 3, and this is how it's going to work. I'm going to start with my third worst film and then move on from there to my third best film, going back and forth counting down like that. Now, keep in mind this is only my opinion, so if you don't agree, I don't care. On with the list. Perhaps you thought I'd forgotten this one, as it was the first animated release of the year, or at least the first release I'm qualifying. I actually had 2 films vying for third, but ultimately decided to choose the one that got under my skin the most. The Lorax actually may be slightly better than the other movie I was considering, but I still feel that it deserves this spot because it doesn't treat the rather delicate material it's focusing on with the level of intelligence and subtlety required. Actually, there really wasn't any subtlety in this film, which would have worked a lot better if they'd only chosen a less serious Dr. Seuss story. Instead, a lot of the movie comes off as really insincere. This is a movie where in the opening musical number, it calls attention to a child glowing green because of pollution. It took a story that was relatively somber and made it a big joke. Between the completely unnecessary villain, the pointless and often wretched musical numbers, and the commercialism, the Lorax has earned its spot on my worst list this year. Boy, was this one a hard one to pick. Brave really wasn't what a lot of us were expecting from Disney and Pixar, and like many, I had my expectations set rather high. It lacks the ambition and some of the quirkiness of Pixar's other stuff, but it still has a lot of excellent characters and relationships, and it's still a pretty damn good film. It was a familiar story, but a familiar story told with charm and style, and just because it wasn't what we were all hoping for doesn't mean it isn't worth your time. The thing that impressed me about Brave is how it fought against the conventions of other stories like it. For something so common as the rebellious teen against overly strict mother, the movie did a pretty good job of making you sympathize with both characters and put a relatively fresh spin on things. Was I hoping for more? Of course I was. Everyone was hoping for better. It may not be at that number 1 spot that Pixar is so accustomed to, but it's still good enough to be at number 3. Since my review, I've sort of regretted the score I gave Madagascar 3. It probably deserved slightly lower than what it got. Even though some of the humor did work, it doesn't change the fact that the sort of humor that was in this movie, basically the same sort of humor in the cartoon, doesn't really work in a full-length feature like this. Madagascar 3 was a mess. It basically distracts the audience with bright colors in 3D to hide the fact that the actual plot is extremely weak, to the point where it's barely even there. It focuses on so many subplots and characters so that the audience will forget that the movie is just once again working towards the same damn thing the other movies were focusing on. And none of the subplots or characters are really all that well developed. Instead of making something new and fresh, they just opted to throw a bunch of stuff at the screen in the hopes that no one would notice. It probably didn't deserve the 6 I gave it, but it definitely deserves to be at number 2 on my worst list.
It's hard to love your job when no one else seems to like you.
Again, a tough call. I essentially had 4 different movies vying for the number 2 and 3 spots on my best of list, and right to the last minutes I was still deciding. The reason WreckIt Ralph makes this list is because of all 4 movies, I probably enjoyed myself most in this one. It almost seems like Disney and Pixar switched roles this year. Disney made the creative, quirky film with the outlandish plot by themselves, and Disney and Pixar made a princess movie. And guess what? The quirky movie stands out more. The characters, particularly Ralph himself and Fix-It Felix, are really fun and likable, and the story lacks a lot of the flaws that some of the other movies I was considering for these 2 spots seem to have. I enjoyed Rise of the Guardians, but as good as parts of it were, there were just too many issues with the pacing and overall plot. Now, I wouldn't say that this movie was as good as Disney and Pixar at their best. I'm still a little disappointed that it didn't fully take advantage of the setting. It definitely isn't as well realized as movies like Toy Story, which is much cleverer with the world it created, but there are still some fun video game related jokes, and the film has a lot going for it. Now, before we get to the best and worst film of the year, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about upcoming releases in 2013, or at least those that have enough information for me to form an opinion. The first animated film coming out this year is Escape from Planet Earth. I will be very surprised if this turns out any better than mediocre. From the trailers, it looks pretty meh. It looks a lot like Planet 51 to me, but without even the sort of clever role reversal that movie introduced, and that movie was still really lackluster. I'm not anticipating a good start to 2013. Disney and Pixar's film this year is another sequel, and regardless of the studio, sequels get a lot of bias from me from the get-go. It doesn't help that the premise to this sequel seems better suited for a television series than a full-length movie. Didn't Disney already do the college thing once? I don't know. But from what I've seen so far, I'm not jumping out of my seat. We'll see. I'm a little more hopeful about Disney's standalone film Frozen, but given that there aren't any teasers or trailers, I can't form too much of an opinion either way. DreamWorks, as always, has 2 releases this year, Turbo, which doesn't excite me no matter how I try to look at it, and The Croods, which could be better, but I'm still on the fence about that one, so we'll see when it comes out. Then there's Epic. No idea what to think about this one. Its trailers have elements that both intrigue and worry me. Illumination is coming out with Despicable Me 2, again, biased about sequels. Still, I couldn't really tell you my thoughts on this one, as I have no clue where they're planning on going with it. There's very little to infer from the trailer so far, the last of which just confused the hell out of me. I mean, the Minions are funny and everything, but what is this movie about? Seriously, I went to IMDb and the summary says Gru, the girls, Dr. Nefario, and the unpredictably hilarious Minions return, along with a host of new characters. Sadly, those are the standout movies of the year. There are 1 or 2 others, but they don't have much information on them. So, back to the countdown. Ice Age 4 could probably be held up as an example of how not to do a sequel. No resemblance to the original movie, characters are dull, plot introduces either ridiculous or absurd elements that stink of desperation. The franchise is tapped of fresh ideas and the creators are obviously just in it for the money at this point. It's boring, it's stupid, the jokes aren't funny, and it's devoid of the care that should go into an animated feature. When one of the main focuses of the movie is essentially a common plot element used in a sitcom, but with mammoths, that's a sign that maybe it's time to call it quits. Honestly, I can barely even remember a lot of this movie because it left so little of an impression. I was mostly just bored the whole time, and of all the crimes a film can commit, especially a kid's film, being boring is probably the most tragic. Although the worst thing about this movie is that there will probably be an Ice Age 5, and I can't even imagine how bad that one is going to be. This is easily the worst animated film of 2012. And the best animated film of the year, which you've probably already guessed. Despite all of the promise of 2012, ParaNorman wound up being the one film that blew me away. It's not just a good animated movie, it's a good movie, period. The story is well crafted and isn't afraid to go to dark and delicate places, but it isn't mean-spirited and does so with the best of intentions. It takes risks, which in my opinion definitely pay off, and it treats its audience with respect. This is a movie with some very adult elements, and I'm not just talking about adult humor and mild language, although it does have some of that too. It has some very mature themes, which it handles with tact. It may seem like this film has some cliche elements at the start, but the outcome is anything but conventional, and on top of that, it's one of the best looking animated films of the year and has a really excellent soundtrack. It's creepy, it's dark, it's heartbreaking, it's sincere, it's clever, it looks and sounds great. Everything about this movie shows that a lot of work and care has gone into every element to make it a truly unique and memorable experience. At least for me, it is a no-brainer for the #1 spot, and I cannot wait to see what WreckIt and Focus come up with next, even if I have to wait another 3 years for it. So that's it for 2012. All in all, it was a pretty damn good year for animation. I'm the Animated Heroine, looking forward to what 2013 brings. Mostly.